ARLECCHINO just got a major nerf. Or did she? Now, why do I say that she got nerfed? Well, to find that out, you're gonna have to watch this video cause I have some exclusive information which no one else has, and that info will clear up the misinformation spreading in the community. But before we start, I would recommend watching my previous video which explains her kit and issues, and even though the kit in that video is kinda outdated, it's still enough to get the gist of it, and it will also help you in understanding this video. So why not give it a shot, right? But to give you a TLDR of her kit, it revolves around Bond of Life, which is essentially an HP gatekeeping mechanic, and the more Bond of Life you have, the more damage ARLECCHINO is doing. And previously you could gain Bond of Life through her skill and burst, but now it's only from skill. Her healing was also shifted from skill to burst, with the burst also getting an additional effect of resetting the skill cooldown when cast. And this is where the misinformation begins. So, if you have been around Twitter or Reddit or any other social media platform you use, you would have read that,
"Oh, she can get 140 Bond of Life now, she is broken."
And that is straight up misinformation, cause she cannot get 140 Bond of Life. I repeat, she cannot get 140 Bond of Life. Heck, she can't even get over 100 Bond of Life. Now, I know what you're thinking. How can this fat dude with the Indian accent say that the 140 Bond of Life thing is a lie when her kit literally makes it seem like you can get that after 10 seconds? Cause hey, if you read the burst description, it literally says that the skill cooldown resets after using her burst. But what it fails to tell you is that it also removes the blood dead directive effect or the X mark on enemies, and the X mark is required to be absorbed by ARLECCHINO through her charge attack to gain Bond of Life. So, for example, in a mono pyro team with Kazuha, the current rotation making rounds in the community is ARLECCHINO's skill followed by her burst, which will reset her skill cooldown, swapping to Kazuha and using his skill, swapping back to ARLECCHINO and using her charge attack after 5 seconds to absorb that X and gain 70% Bond of Life. After which, you do her skill again, swap to your supports, and just like before, 5 seconds after her skill, you swap back to ARLECCHINO and use her charge attack to gain an additional 70% Bond of Life, which would make the total Bond of Life she has 140, right? Right? No, cause that's not how the rotation works. Cause as soon as you do her burst, it clears the X mark on enemies, which means even if you do a charge attack, you won't gain any Bond of Life. And this is the misinformation currently spreading in the community. So I hope that whatever I have said till now clears things up. Now, with that in mind, her best rotation is her skill followed by support abilities, swapping back to ARLECCHINO and using her charge attack after 5 seconds to gain 70% Bond of Life, followed by a normal attack spam. And when you wanna end the rotation, generally after 8 to 10 seconds, you use her burst to reset her skill cooldown and heal her at the same time. And then you repeat the entire cycle. So, if you have been enjoying this video so far, then a sub to the channel would be ARLECCHINO. Now, whatever I have said till now is based on the current beta. So, her burst clearing the blood dead directive effect or the X mark might very well be a bug. And if it is, then I'll delete this video or at the very least add the word outdated to the title. But if not, then this is how things stand. Previously, you could get 85% Bond of Life through her skill and burst, but now you can only get 70% Bond of Life. And not to mention, you are also dependent on her burst for healing, which I consider to be a nerf. Now, you might consider that to be a positive, and to be honest, you aren't exactly wrong in saying that, but that's a POV thing. Me personally, I don't like ARLECCHINO relying on her burst for heals, but you on the other hand might be a god gamer deity, and don't mind it being on burst. As for her constellations, in particular her C1, which increases the damage she does through her pyro-infused normals and also adds resistance to interruption in her kit, which I believe should be a part of the base kit itself. And just to clarify, I mean the resistance to interruption part and not the damage increase. So, from an F2B point of view, that's a nerf, cause well, we ain't getting C1, right? And from a whale point of view, C1 is extremely important, C2 is decent I guess, but not that important. important, C3 is really good, C4 is nice, and C6 is just extra damage. So I guess it could be considered a buff. Now, if you have been listening to what I have been yapping, then you would know that previously she could get 85% bond of life through her skill and burst. But now you can only get 70% because the burst doesn't give bond of life anymore. And not to mention, you are consuming 6.5% of the current bond of life per hit while having slightly more damage per normal attack. Now comparing this to her previous kit where she was getting 85% bond of life and consuming 5.5% per hit but also doing slightly less damage per normal attack, you will realize that this current kit is a slight nerf compared to the original, even in terms of damage. With all that being said, two major issues I mentioned in my previous video as well still remain. First is the complexity of her kit, which will make it hard for casual folks to understand, and second is her reliance on shielders to stay alive. And of course, like I said before, if you are a god gamer, then it doesn't apply to you, but talking about the majority, it will affect their ability to play her. Now, if you have any questions regarding her or anything in general, then comment down below, and if I get enough questions, then I'll make a video answering them all, and if not, then I'll reply to each question individually. So either way, you're getting your question answered. Alright, so I have to admit one thing to you all. I previously said that you cannot get 140% bond of life, which is a lie, cause you can. And how do you get that? Well, all you have to do is start off with a skill followed by a charge attack after 5 seconds, and then you wait for 30 seconds for a skill cooldown to finish, and then use that followed by a charge attack again 5 seconds later, and this way you will have 140% bond of life in 35 seconds, and it will only cost you a billion damage, which you could have done with your support and also your sanity.